Hello, welcome to part 2 of the webinar. Now, before we continue, I've noticed that the webinar has been edited, so you're missing a little bit of my narration. Okay, ready for part 2. English as part of their hopes and their dreams. They didn't see themselves long term as English speakers. They didn't feel connected emotionally towards the language. It was all very practical. There was only 3 students in my sample that showed any identification at all with native speaker culture, and this is exactly what they said. Now, have a look at the first student. Plan for searching for a job, but only listed England or Australia, native speaker cultures. The second student here, I think, shows true integrative culture, a true desire to be part of British culture, to integrate with us, to affiliate with us. I have interesting with British and UK, and I want to be the British one. The third, I think, is very interesting. I intend to continue my study abroad, so it is important. This mindset that English is linked to white Caucasians. So I then asked the students, where will you use the language? Who will you use the language with? And I asked 88 students over 4 high schools and also 8 teachers, how frequently will you be using English with native speakers? Now, the orange is the teachers and the blue are the students. Can you see teachers unanimously said that their students will sometimes use English with native speakers? The students are a bit more spread between often and rarely. I asked the same question. How often, how frequently will you interact in English with members of the ASEAN countries, the 10 Southeast Asian countries? Now you see there, the teachers think more often, they're unanimous. The students, fairly similar. See? Native speakers, ASEAN citizens. The third question I asked is how often will you use English with Asians who are not part of ASEAN? So Korea, Japan, China, India. And you see both teachers and students think less frequently. Only 19% of students think often that they will be using English with non-ASEAN Asians. Finally, I thought very interesting, I asked how frequently will you be using English with non-native speakers who are not Asian, so Brazilians, Russians, Greeks. And it was almost as if students and teachers hadn't even considered that there was non-Asians who didn't speak English natively. I haven't really speculated why that is, apart from many Indonesians link the word foreigner with bule, which is linked to white, and they link bule with native speakers. I don't know, that's speculation on my part. So let's have a look at the reality of the situation. Foreign workers in Indonesia. As you can see, around 50%, 48% of people working in Indonesia who are foreigners are in Jakarta. So if you want to interact with foreigners, go to Jakarta, the capital city. The second biggest wedge, which is just over a fifth of foreigners, are in West Java. And that is significant because that's where I did my research, in Bandung. Now, if we look at the nationalities of the foreign workers in Indonesia, the majority here are from Asia, but not ASEAN, so Chinese, Japanese, Korean. And we got a significant wedge here of ASEAN citizens, 13%. So the majority of people working in Indonesia and are foreigners are Asian, not Bule, not Caucasians. Of the European slice here, I think the majority are Dutch, German and French, not native speakers of English. Now, there we go, I've written French, German and Dutch. Now, the working foreigners from ASEAN countries are almost exclusively from inner circle countries, so they're likely to have their own versions of English and be quite proficient at using English, I would say. As far as tourism goes, it's predominantly Singaporeans and Malaysians, lots of Japanese and Koreans here. Chinese are on the rise, Chinese tourists to Indonesia. But again, there's some Australians here, but apart from that, very few native speakers are visiting as tourists. It's predominantly from Asia, with Chinese tourists on the rise. So therefore, I think we can see clearly it's much more likely that Indonesians in Indonesia are going to be speaking English with Singaporeans, Chinese, Malaysians, Koreans, Filipinos. So why on earth are we focusing on British or US English in language schools at all? Because Indonesians in Indonesia really aren't going to be speaking that variety of English, because the people just aren't there. So I asked my sample of teachers and students what skills are important. This is what students mainly believed, that reading and writing was necessary to get through higher education and perhaps to get a job. But once they're in the workplace and in their life after university, writing especially, and to a lesser extent reading, is not important. It's just a skill they need to get through education. After leaving education, students predict that they will speak, not write. Speaking has a social function. So reading and writing, it's an instrumental drive to get a practical skill for a tangible reason. Whereas speaking and a social function, it's a more intrinsic desire to learn. Interestingly, students hardly mentioned using the internet at all as a reason to use English. I'm wondering whether they use social networking and the internet in Indonesian language, not English. Teachers believe something slightly different, that writing is very important all through life. Teaching methodology, they said, is totally different from when they were students at school, and they understand the benefits of communicative language teaching. They're very open to change, but interestingly, they want more control over the syllabus, the content and how it's taught, rather than a very top-down approach from national government. They want more control, but they don't want students to have any control. Students shouldn't play any part at all in determining what's in the syllabus. Now, I've had a think about the reasons for this. Now, lots of research says, and it's clear when you're there, that Indonesia isn't a culture of the written word at all. There's almost no public libraries. Books are very hard to find and they're very expensive. There isn't really any famous Indonesian authors. It's more of a storytelling culture and a music culture, a culture of speaking and listening. And could this explain why learners haven't prioritised reading and writing? Because it's just not part of their culture. Now, me and Naima and I have discussed this theory a lot, which I'm very interested in. This is the power distance index of Gert Hofstede, who's a Dutch psychologist, I think. Now, the power distance index shows the distance between those who are in control in society. So, politicians, teachers, parents, older people, people of a higher social class, and the people down at the bottom of the ladder, who would be children, students, people of a lower social class who have less say. Now, let's compare Indonesia and Great Britain. Look how high the power distance index here is, the difference between those who hold power and those at the bottom, compared to Great Britain, where it's half as much. And we're supposed to have a class system. I wonder what it's like in the USA. So this shows that Indonesia is a very, very hierarchical society where the people at the top, it's less easy to question them and give them your own opinion and disagree with them. Interestingly as well, look at the individualism index between Great Britain and Indonesia. Indonesia is quite a collective society, where we're more individualistic in Britain. So if this is true, and Indonesia is a very hierarchical society, could this explain the teacher's belief that students should have no input and no control at all over their syllabus? What sort of grammar should we use? Now, Widdowson talks about mutual intelligibility, just being able to understand each other. And this is driven by the need to communicate effectively. So if there's two speakers of diverse versions of English, let's say an Indian and an Indonesian, they will find the areas of language that then overlap, the areas which are common to both, and they will use that common form of English. For the parts of the English that they don't understand, they will learn strategies to ask for clarification, negotiate meaning, and gradually the English between the Indian and the Indonesian will stabilize into a form which both can understand. Now, in British English, we talk about mistakes and inaccuracies. Here are some sins which, if you commit these sins, it doesn't stop you from understanding each other at all. The third person singular, I walk, you walk, he or she walks. If you drop that S, we still understand each other. The definite article, if you drop that again, we all understand what we mean. Oops. Now, relative pronouns. In Indonesia, there is only one relative pronoun, and it's yang. We have who, which, where, when, whose, that, and they're very specific. Now, if you can treat who and which interchangeably, Tim is the person who is giving this webinar. Tim is the person which is giving this webinar. You understand both. They can be used interchangeably, but it's still seen as a sin in British English to get it wrong, isn't it? How many hours have I spent in class trying to get students to differentiate between the gerund and the infinitive? But if you commit this sin, it's still understood. And question tags. How many question tags have we got in English? Wouldn't she, shouldn't I, haven't you? Is it, could I? So many. Why not just use universal question tags? In French, I think it's n'est-ce pas. In Indonesia, nga. And I think increasingly in English, isn't it? In it? I just did it myself, isn't it? It can still be understood. So what is the problem with committing these sins in grammar? Okay, before we move on to pronunciation, that's end of part 2.